1932 was also a year of decision for Americans. Republican President Herbert Hoover campaigned for re-election, only to find that everywhere he went, his name had become synonymous with failure. Shanty towns of unemployed men were now called Hoovervilles. Newspapers were Hoover blankets. Empty pockets, Hoover flags.
The very first task of this country is to see that no man, woman, or child shall go hungry.
It was said of Hoover that even dogs took an instinctive dislike to him.
We have yet to go a long ways into capture.
And in the 1932 campaign, one man wired him, vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous.
Strategy which we have established is
California, cast 44 votes for Franklin D. Roosevelt.
New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt was the Democratic Party candidate. He had been struck by polio in 1921. He was known more for his charm than his accomplishments. Most people were not sure what he meant when he promised a new deal to the American people.
friends, the time has come.
Neither was he. But Roosevelt appeared optimistic, confident, and he wasn't Herbert Hoover.
Our campaign slogan, Sissy.
Happy days are here again.
Good, that's right.
Roosevelt won in the greatest electoral landslide America had ever seen. And he faced perhaps the greatest challenge ever presented to an American leader. The 4 million unemployed of 1930 had turned into 16 million by 1933, 25% of the American workforce.
I mean, the American economy was in free fall. Economists disagree to some extent on this, but we could have lost everything in 1933. It was that bad.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
On Inauguration Day, nearly 100,000 people braved a cold March morning to hear what the new president would do.
This great nation will endure as it has endured. Let me assert
That magnificent resonance coming out.
the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We have nothing to fear but fear itself, and everybody would look at each other, they'd nod their head.
Let us unite.
And when he'd say, my friends, everybody could feel he was talking to him. That was one of his friends, that was one of his people.
And me, a little black boy, down in Georgia, hearing that voice over the radio, you know, I felt it. It wasn't that he told it to Dad and Daddy told it to me, or told it to Mama and me. No, he was talking to little Ossie sitting there listening to him. He could, through the magic of his voice and radio, reach out and involve you in the great adventure of making America work again.
Roosevelt moved decisively to restore confidence in the country's financial system. In one daring move, he closed the nation's banks and ordered the Treasury to rush them $2 billion in new currency.
Let me make it clear that the banks will take care of all needs.
The reaction was to his closing of the bank, thank God, somebody has come in and had done something.
When the banks reopened, deposits easily exceeded withdrawals. Rescuing the banks was only the beginning. In his first 100 days in the White House, Roosevelt moved at a breathtaking pace, regulating business, helping farmers, pumping new money into the economy. It was the most massive intervention in the lives of the American people the country had ever known. Roosevelt put people on the government payroll when private business didn't hire them fast enough. The wild boys of the road became part of the Civilian Conservation Corps, planting trees and building roads across America.
They shipped us out to the bottom of Grand Canyon. We'd build trails, you know, for people coming in sightseeing. We got $5 a month. and they sent 25 home for your family to live on.
And here's was the federal government stepping in to help people. It may not have been enough. In some cases, it didn't help, but somebody was trying. And one had that feeling that maybe it was going to work.
Millions of Americans had been helped in the first year of the New Deal. But for millions more, the year 1933 ended in frustration. President Roosevelt had lifted their spirits, but not their circumstances.
After a time, the haunting thought could not be put down that maybe this Great Depression was never going to end. But with the sense of rising expectations, people are stirred out of their lethargy, and in 1934, there is the most radical mood of any year of the Great Depression.
President Roosevelt had contributed to that radical mood when he became the first American president to say that labor had a right to unionize. But businessmen remained defiantly anti-union. In the spring of 1934, emboldened dock workers closed ports all along the Pacific coast. In San Francisco, their strike turned violent.
We heard on the radio that all this terrible stuff was going on the waterfront. And my husband was down there. And I remember my mother and I were frightened and very upset. Would Harold make it?
It got so bad that 2 men were killed. They were killed by bullets, ostensibly from the police. Nobody really ever figured that one out totally.
Harold was right on the corner where one was killed. Shocked the city. Killings then used to shock people.
The funeral for the 2 murdered strikers drew 50,000 people.
That funeral was so... It so shocked the city. It was so impressive.
That was enough to infuriate the people of San Francisco. So much, they said, we've had it. Every day we'll watch these longshoremen and seamen getting beaten and clubbed. We've had it up to our eyebrows. By God, whatever it takes to win a strike, we're going to win it. And they stopped. All work. Even a barber says, we refuse to give a haircut to anybody until the strike is over. We sympathize with the union. We sympathize with the men. And so they shut the port down, shut the city down.
Little stores, closed until our boys win.
The city was quiet as hell. Nothing moved for 4 solid days.
The longshoremen won virtually all their demands, encouraging workers across the country to move against management. In 1934, there were more than 1,800 strikes for union recognition.
Coal miners, steel workers, warehouse, different people, packing house. They said if a bunch of starving seamen and longshoremen could weather the storm, then we could do it back in Pittsburgh, or we could do it here, we could do it there.
Labor unrest was only one of Roosevelt's problems in 1934. Economic recovery had stalled, and critics complained that he'd gone too far. The constitutionality of some New Deal programs were being challenged in the courts, and business leaders were warning that FDR had steered the country recklessly to the left. But Roosevelt knew that his program still hadn't reached millions of desperate Americans, and he didn't know how long they would wait. Discontent and frustration gave rise to any number of demagogues, including the charismatic radio priest Father Charles Coughlin,
Children and shelterless men and women.
Dr. Francis Townsend, self-proclaimed advocate for the elderly, radical spellbinders who claimed the New Deal was dying. During 1934, one of these would-be saviors developed a national following and presidential ambitions.
Because Hoover wanted to plow up every
He was called the Kingfish. Senator and former Louisiana Governor Huey Long.
After we told you people that Hoover was a numbskull.
The best entertainment you had was when Huey came to town to speak.
They put it in to plow up every third row of cotton.
Everybody went to hear him, whether they were for him or against him. He was marvelous.
The Lord has answered the prayer. He has called the barbecue.
He used such expressive language.
He said to
You just had to listen.
5 million
And when people listened, many discovered they liked what they heard.
What Huey Long was saying was that he was going to soak the rich and he was going to give that money to the poor. His plan was never really carefully worked out, and in his own state in Louisiana, he fell notably short of redistributing the wealth. But it had a kind of direct appeal that the more complex programs of the New Deal lacked, and also provided a focus for the animus against the rich that had been building during the years of the Great Depression.
Long promised every American a house, a car, a radio. In return, he wanted power. Absolute power.
You couldn't do anything in Louisiana unless you got his okay. He was vicious. And if you told him no, he'd knock you down.
He had built up a private police force. He had shown his contempt for the democratic processes, and that created a great deal of worry in Washington.
Not just Southerners, but Midwestern farmers and New York factory workers were joining Long Share Our Wealth clubs. By 1935, Franklin Roosevelt was privately calling Huey Long the most dangerous man in America.
They set up and called General Hugh S. Johnson down here to take charge of that.
When you have food riots, you have the makings of a dictatorship. Don't think you wouldn't do it too. You might vote the wrong way. He rose on the votes of the people, and Huey Long was rising on the votes of the people too.
Huey Long never got the chance to run for president. He was cut down by an assassin in September 1935.